Thank you, everyone, for coming today. We had a sold-out audience here, and so we're glad that you showed up. We were so overwhelmed with requests that we had limited seating, so I hope we didn't scare away people by that. But we're going to go ahead, and we have such a remarkable array of speakers here today. It's not every day that Matt Bryce is here in Washington, and to make use of his time with Dan Freeds and Michael Carpenter is just a very great array of speakers that we're presenting to you. And I'm very grateful today that for Margarita Senova and her hard work in putting this together for this great event, which we started planning over 6 months ago to try to get it on everybody's schedules because we knew that Nord Stream would not go away. New administration coming in. And still we don't perceive a prioritizing of the energy issue as other issues are kind of on the policy radar. So we're anxious to try to put this back on the policy radar and make it visible so that people can see and hear about it, and we can start a discussion again. Just as there's a Nord Stream 2.0, there will be a Jamestown 2.0 on Nord Stream in the spring, so stay tuned. I'd like to recognize sitting in our audience a couple of Jamestown board members, Rob Spring sitting in the back, and of course on the front row, our honorary and honorable chairman, William DeVogel. Our conference today is a very unique one. It will explore a very important topic that concerns both Europe and the United States. As many of you know, the Nord Stream pipeline was built on the seabed of the Baltic already and has capacity to transport 55 million cubic meters of gas directly to Germany. It was commissioned in 2011 with Moscow's intention to bypass the Baltic states and Poland and deliver gas to the lucrative Western markets. The project also aimed to undermine European energy security by limiting both diversity of supplies and diversity of transport routes to the EU markets and make them more dependent on Russian gas, thus increasing Russian economic, political influence in Western Europe. So from the very start, contrary to Moscow's claim that Nord Stream was purely an economic project, it was pursuing economic, political, and security objectives. Now Moscow wants to double the capacity of that transit route to 100 BCM per year, channeling up to 80% of all Russian gas exports to Europe through Germany, thus directly reaching the lucrative Western markets and bypassing most of Eastern and Central Europe. But from this, there are several major problems that the project presents. First of all is that the Nord Stream expansion would bypass a number of key U.S. allies in Central Eastern Europe, including the Baltic states and Poland, and would potentially eliminate Ukraine as a major transit route to Europe. Consequently, it may also affect Moldova, Belarus, and the Balkan states. The project challenges the European Union's energy diversity as well and is based on a diversity of energy sources and diversity of transit routes. So Nord Stream could undermine the legal regulations of the EU, including the third energy package designed to curtail energy monopolies. The European Union will have to find a consensus among its member states to protect both its energy security and its anti-monopoly policies. The project would also undermine the expansion of U.S. LNG supplies to Europe if Gazprom starts damping and decreasing gas prices to undercut the budding spot market and fairly compete with American LNG companies. In light of all the above, our conference today will examine and provide a detailed and comprehensive analysis of Russian objectives, European responses, and American policies related to this large project. Many of those people that tried to implement and were carrying out those policies are present on this panel today. So we hope you'll be able to offer useful insights and value recommendations to the U.S. policy community and our European allies on how to deal with Moscow's new energy pursuits in Europe that can undercut U.S. LNG deliveries. Margarita, the show is yours.
Today, the circumstances surrounding the Nord Stream project are changing, and sometimes they're changing rapidly. In July, the U.S. Congress imposed sanctions on companies working with Russia. So those sanctions against Russia, the latest round, which is yet to be fully implemented, may derail the project. This month, the European Commission proposed changing legislation to apply EU energy rules to all new and existing import pipelines, including Nord Stream 2. And now Denmark is also planning to introduce a law that could potentially stop Nord Stream construction in its territorial waters based on security and foreign policy. These are all developments that we're going to discuss today. But the major development that happened in Germany is that the Social Democrats are not going to be in the new coalition government. The Social Democrats are supportive. They used to be supportive and they continue to be supportive of Nord Stream 2. But the Green Party, which is going to be a new coalition party, is opposed to it. So all these developments, we're going to pay attention to them today in a discussion with our distinguished speakers, Michael Carpenter, Matt Breiser, Daniel Fried, and we're going to be joined by Anders Asmund in half an hour. Let's start with our first speaker today, but I'm saying again, it's going to be more of a discussion. What are Russia's geopolitical objectives through its energy projects in Europe? Michael.
Thanks, Margarita, and it's great to be here with my former co-conspirators, Matt Breiser and Dan Fried, also former bosses. Let me start by saying that Russia uses a full spectrum of tools, both hard power and soft power, to achieve its objectives in Europe and in the United States. Chief among these objectives is weakening Western countries internally, splitting the EU and NATO, and finding countries within the broader transatlantic community that can be picked off to undermine consensus. And then thirdly, broadly delegitimizing the rules-based international order that emerged after World War II. Those are sort of the broad strategic goals. And in order to achieve those goals, Russia relies, as I said, on a diversified toolkit. This includes hard power, military force in certain cases, as we've seen in Georgia and Ukraine, but it also relies on information warfare, by which I mean both cyber and propaganda operations, influence operations. It relies on corruption as a tool to influence political outcomes in foreign countries, and it relies on energy. Energy is one of the tools that Russia uses for both coercion and for influence. So what we've seen in the last couple decades is that Russia has used Gazprom and gas markets specifically, but also, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a second if we have time, about with electricity markets and with nuclear power to both coerce governments and also influence them via energy companies and industrial lobbies, and also to influence political elites directly. Why don't I stop there as sort of that?
Does it mean that it's not an economic project, purely economic project, as Russia is promoting it to
If you're talking about Nord Stream 2, the notion that this is a commercial project, as Chancellor Merkel has repeatedly said, it may be a commercial project, but it is clearly also a geopolitical or political project. And when all you have to do is think about the capacity of Russian pipe from the Russian Federation to Europe, which is about 250 BCM, and compare that to the actual supply, which last year was about 178 BCM. Russia does not need additional capacity at this moment to be able to service markets in Europe. And so, to my mind, this makes this a political project, but sure, it could be commercial as well.
How is Russia managing to find support among European countries and companies to do these projects? Clearly, they are strategic and political projects from our understanding.
Well, so for the participants in the project, I think you will find that there are financial and commercial incentives to participate. There is also an element of coercion that goes into getting some of these companies to participate in a project like this if they were otherwise less inclined because of some of the regulatory decisions that the EU has taken so far. And this involves quiet conversations about access to the Russian market, what sorts of opportunities lie ahead. Need I say, and I'm going to be careful in how I phrase this, but need I say that some of Mr. Putin's closest relationships in Europe with leaders or former leaders like Gerhard Schroeder or Silvio Berlusconi or Miloš Zeman, these are very close personal but also geopolitical relations, which, if you look closely, in almost all of these cases, Viktor Yanukovych, were all lubricated, facilitated, enhanced, choose your verb, by key Western political advisors in these countries that I just mentioned who had ties to or have ongoing ties to the Russian energy sector.
Let's turn to Matt Reiser, who is going to outline what are the Nord Stream project's implications for Europe.
Thank you, Margarita. Thanks for getting me here, and Glenn too, and Willem, thanks for making it possible for me to be here. Thanks to Jamestown. Yeah, it's amazing to sit on the panel with my two favorite people I think I ever worked with at the State Department. So that's, wow, overwhelming. Thank you. To understand what the implications are for Europe, maybe I'll pick up on Mike's incredibly clear explanation of what Russia's intentions are, embellish that a little, describe what the EU has started to do, having recognized that this is Russia's game, and then why Nord Stream 2 undermines that, if that sounds okay. So I recall back in 2005 or 2006, I was having a conversation with then first Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia. A very nice conversation. We had clashed at a conference somewhere in Europe. And afterward, he said, you know, you Americans are actually not the best negotiators because you are often too soft and even kind. We Russians are much tougher, and that's because, you know you are strong. We know we are not. We know we have few advantages in the geopolitical world. Energy, especially natural gas supplies, is one of those. So we want to maximize the utility of that lever that we have. It's not necessarily, it's not immoral, it's smart, a smart way to play the game. What would be unsmart or stupid would be if we didn't react accordingly. And so we did react, and the EU reacted. We've got this thing called the Southern Corridor, which really, as Dan will recall, we really pushed before the EU, I think, was ready to accept it. I was often asked questions, especially in Berlin, well, why do you care so much? And why don't you go back to the United States and we'll take care of our interests ourselves? But I would explain, well, I care because, again, we were, Dan and I, trying to figure out back in 04, 05, why were some of our allies, pick one you wish, okay, that one, why is Germany in particular so hesitant to stand up to what Russia was doing, frankly, in Georgia? You all remember the whole series of events that were happening in the early 2000s, passportization of the separatists and recognizing, sort of quasi-recognizing the legal authority of the separatists, facilitating smuggling through the Roki Tunnel, a whole series of things. And we'd go and talk to many of our allies, and they would say, well, we really don't want to rock the boat on energy. Glenn and I were in Kiev a couple years ago with Willem and others on the Jamestown board. And we asked a Crimean leader, you may recall, how's Turkey responding to, because Turkey's Crimean brothers and sisters. And this one leader's response was, well, they pledged support for us. Yes, they're brothers and sisters, but remember, we are dependent on Russia for 60% of our natural gas. So this was a very senior Turkish leader saying, so there are limits to what we can do. So what I'm trying to say is Russia uses very effectively, as Mike was saying, these tools for coercive reasons or simply to have influence. The EU's third energy package and the strategy that evolved in the mid-2000s reflected a recognition and a readiness to be smart. Not have a confrontation with Russia, but not just lie down on their backs, and in fact, pursue the strategic goal of a single, unified European energy market. Because once that exists, once the market takes over and sets prices based on supply and demand, rather than monopolistic forces, well then you don't have to worry about the monopolist using leverage anymore. So it's all about facilitating the evolution of the market. And the big idea is, again, single, unified, everybody working together. Well, Nord Stream works exactly against that, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. So the impact is, number one, you make it difficult for Europe to achieve that goal, a single, unified European energy market. And number two, as Mike was saying, you divide and conquer. You generate tension within the European Union between the eastern member states most exposed to what Russia has done to Ukraine, and then the larger Western or Central European states who don't necessarily worry so much about that, but worry very much about A, the security of supply of energy, and B, the corporate interests. So my last comment is, yeah, we see that the CDU and Chancellor Merkel have shifted their support for Nord Stream since the SPD is no longer going to be in the coalition. Of course it was the SPD and Gerhard Schroeder who were responsible for Germany's strong support for Nord Stream. And that was precisely because of what Mike was talking about. Personal interests, corporate interests, but we all know what Gerhard Schroeder did a couple of months before he left office. He passed a whole series of tax incentives for Nord Stream 2. Thereafter, 2 months later, joined the board of Nord Stream, and also now is was going to be chairman of the board of Rosneft. Thank you.
A question about the Eastern European countries that are going to be bypassed by Nord Stream, would be bypassed if this project is realized. What is their reaction, and what can we expect from the European Union? Is the European Union going to listen to those countries?
Yeah, obviously we've seen Poland fight and resist this project. They're not going to be able to stop it ultimately, right? I mean, if you look at the law of the sea, if that's going to be applicable in this situation, no state can block a pipeline across its continental shelf. You can conduct long investigations about the environmental downsides, but you really can't block the pipeline. So Poland will feel even more, I guess, uncomfortable about the commitment of the other EU member states to its vital security needs. In the Baltic states, where I spent a lot of time running a research institute in Tallinn for a few years, they're baffled. I mean, they realize, this is all happening over their heads. There's going to be no direct economic impact on them in the short run, but they want to be good NATO allies. They're looking for ways, at least the Estonians are, to be resistant, but they realize they have limited leverage. But what it will do, though, another impact of Nord Stream is it will retard the development of a regional market that's unified and liquid in the Baltic states and Finland. There's enough market demand in Finland and the Baltic states to create a liquid natural gas trading submarket there. And again, once that happens, there's no more leverage that Gazprom or anybody else can apply. So that is at least not advanced if the project is one that bypasses them rather than goes through them. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bryce. Ambassador Fried, the sanctions that United States Congress adopted recently, and there have been several rounds of sanctions against Russia for the annexation of Crimea and then the invasion of Donbass and others. How these sanctions are going to impact companies that are working with Russia, with Gazprom on this project? Are they going to affect them at all?
Short answer to that is probably not. And I will answer that, but I wanted to give a shout out to two people. One is to Ambassador Vershbow, who's in the audience, who was, the record is clear, warning Washington about the implications of Russia's attempt to develop energy leverage over Europe a few years before Washington was ready to hear it. See, he won't say so, I did. I think that ought to be recognized. And second shout out is to the EU, which actually did take steps to reduce the negative impacts of Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2. And that means that while Nord Stream 2 is still, in my view, a bad idea, and ultimately a political project designed to increase Russia's leverage, as my colleagues have described, the downside risks are more shallow because of what the United States has done and because of what the EU has done. So this is an example of transatlantic policy success, which took years. It really took 20 years of thinking and hard work, and then 10 years of organized effort by the EU, including the Commission. It gets a lot of bad press as the Brussels bureaucracy, but they did a good job. It doesn't mean Nord Stream 2 is a good idea. It does mean that the downside risks are less than what they used to be. And 10 years ago, when I was in Budapest, I heard the best analogy about this. They said, the Hungarians told me that they believed that Europe needed to develop a secondary gas pipeline network so that if the Russians step on a gas artery, we don't get a heart attack. Colorful and accurate. And that shows the direction of EU thinking. They have developed the capillaries. That, combined with Ukraine's weaning itself from Russian energy, has meant that Ukraine, one of the chief objects of Russian gas leverage, is no longer nearly as vulnerable. There are reverse flows of gas that go from Hungary and Slovakia. Sanction skeptics they may be, but they have no objection to making money and in doing so helping Ukraine and reducing Moscow's leverage. This is all the happy product of EU policy. So there is some good news. You know, we're not used to good news these days in Washington, but here it is. There has been progress. Now, with respect to sanctions, when the Obama administration organized the sanctions against Russia, we did not go after the gas sector generally. We did not go after immediate oil sales. What we did was go after future oil production, so-called frontier technology. Arctic offshore, deep sea, shale. The idea was if you go after immediate production, you cause a price spike. That produces a windfall for Vladimir Putin, which was not our intention. We didn't go after gas because the Europeans were too sensitive about that, and there was no way to go after gas without going after immediate production. But if you go after frontier oil production, you are also hitting frontier gas, because oil and gas deposits are generally the same thing. So we went after future gas development indirectly by going after the sources of future Russian production and didn't touch immediate production. That's where we left it. The bill that Congress passed last August 2nd, CATSA, the Countering American Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, contains Section 232. It addresses sanctions against pipeline projects. However, it is discretionary. And second, in the amendment process, the Congress added that the administration should implement these sanctions in coordination with allies. That language was added at the request of the EU and Germany, and I have to say that I supported adding that language. I don't like Nord Stream 2, but I did not then and do not now consider sanctions to be the appropriate tool. Not because I love it, but Nord Stream 2, but because sanctions against major German companies would eat at the political coalition we assembled to push back against Russia for its aggression using sanctions. And because the EU had acted to reduce the downside risks of Nord Stream 2, it wasn't as critical as it might be. Now, the administration, the Trump administration, I have to say, has issued guidance for the implementation of this new sanctions law, which I find generally sound. And if you know how to read these documents, I would conclude, if you do a kind of forensic analysis, that the pros, the professionals, and the experts are running that policy and drafting those documents. There has been no evidence of anybody's thumb on the scale. That's good news, and I want to give credit to the professionals at the State Department, Treasury, and NSC who are doing their jobs under complicated circumstances. Their guidance on Section 232 makes clear that this administration is going to be careful rather than aggressive in implementing it. They affirmed that it is discretionary, affirmed that they are aware of the requirement for coordination with allies. They said that it does not apply to pipelines which transit Russia but transport somebody else's gas. That would be basically CPC. I think that was a sound move by the administration. And it draws a line of August 2nd, 2017, the date of the enactment of the bill, and says contracts signed after that count. So basically, the administration is signaling that it will implement Section 232 on pipelines very cautiously. I hope the administration implements other elements of that bill more aggressively. And I can think of some that's outside, outside the discussion here. But this is a case where I think the strategic arguments against Nord Stream 2 are valid. You've heard them. I could not improve upon the arguments. But the tools to deal with it ought to be through Brussels and working with bilateral governments. And although I'm not going to be here for Amos Hochstein's presentation, I have to tell you, when he's not around, he was one of the few people in the Obama administration more hawkish on Russia issues than Toria Nuland or myself, just so you know who's up here. I think he may have a number of ideas and recommendations for the administration on how to work against Nord Stream 2 without using the sanctions tool, and to do so in coordination with the Europeans. So I'm apologize for the wonkish walk through the regulations, but this stuff counts. That's how it actually is implemented, and that's how the corporations look at it.
So practically, we're trying to preserve Germany's cooperation on the implementation of the sanctions against Russia for Ukraine.
Well, sure. I mean, the Germans were good.
That's more important at this point?
Look, the Germans were solid, all right? The Chancellor Merkel and also the Foreign Ministry, which was SPD run, faced down powerful constituencies in Germany that were against the sanctions. The Germans played it straight. They always kept their word. You need to give them some slack and some credence under those circumstances. Had they not kept their word, I might be more inclined to go the dirty route and push the sanctions. But under these circumstances, they had earned the right to have their position respected, although I wouldn't go so far as to say I actually like Nord Stream 2, because I don't.
Thank you very much. Yes, Nord Stream 2 is going to channel 80% of Russian gas through Germany directly, completely isolating Eastern Europe, and we're not even thinking about Belarus in this case. We're not even talking about Moldova yet. We're not mentioning that much about the Balkans, because pipelines through Ukraine are going to be to cease to exist probably, if that happens. But the implications are very serious for the new European Union members, and here is Anders Haslund, who is going to tell us what is the European Union dilemma on Nord Stream, and is it likely to be resolved?
Thank you very much, Margarita, and thank you, Glenn and Jamestown Foundation for the invitation. Apologies for arriving late because of a prior engagement before I knew of this, but I'm very happy to be here. Yes, what I would like to give you is the EU perspective. I was just in Brussels last week and discussed this a bit, and I would divide it into three parts. One is policy, a second is EU policymakers, and the third is the national issues that have an implication on this. If we start on energy policy, I would say that the EU energy policy is essentially two things: competition policy and security policy. But these are the two central elements. And the energy policy is essentially set firm in the third energy package of 2009, which has been repeated and somewhat reinforced in the energy union declared in 2015. And what this implies is marketization in a number of different ways. What you hear most about, it is unbundling of transportation and sales, which is driven very hard. It's also free access to pipelines, and it is competition, the formation of a real market for gas. But it's also energy security. In the presentation of the Energy Union, it stands very firm that it's a big problem that in several cases there is only one supplier of gas to certain EU countries. And there should also not be any dominant supply line. And needless to say, Nord Stream 2 is against all these principles. It would say that Russian export to the European Union today is about 130 billion cubic meters a year, could be slightly more. The Ukrainian pipeline in itself is 120 billion cubic meters. On top of that, 20 billion cubic meters can go through Belarus and Poland. And then we have, on top of that, Nord Stream 1, 55 billion cubic meters. Until recently, it could only be used to 50% because of EU competition rules. Now it can be used fully. And with Nord Stream 2, this would be 110 billion cubic meters, 2 times 55 billion cubic meters a year. And that would mean that slightly more than 80% of all gas from Russia would go through one pipeline system, which is completely unacceptable from any security point of view. And as Margareta mentioned, this would also then mean that Germany gets a major role as a transit country, which is essentially a big rent. Currently, Ukraine can make $4 billion a year on Russian transit of gas. It has been $2 billion, but it's rising to $4 billion because of higher transit tariffs. And that's 2 to 4% of Ukraine's GDP, which happens to be $100 billion, so it's easy for us to count. And what is clearly the Russian intention is to abandon the Ukrainian transit pipeline altogether, which is, of course, a big waste. But if Russia wants to spend $10 billion or so on the Nord Stream 2, the European energy companies that will be the beneficiaries of it are not going to complain about it. But apart from this being a major energy insecurity and hitting Ukraine, it would also mean that it will be a major market disturbance. If you have such a monopolistic delivery of gas, Russia accounts for about 1/3 of EU's imports of gas, you will be in a situation where prices can easily move upwards. All the East European countries understand this perfectly well. Poland, the Baltic countries, in particular Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Romania have all reacted sharply against. Bulgaria has been a bit hesitant. Even Italy has been against Nord Stream 2 because they say, why Nord Stream 2 and not South Stream? Probably this can be resolved by Gazprom in one way or the other, because there are many possible deals to be made. But currently, Italy has a negative view. Then looking upon the European Union decision-making machinery, the key person here is and should be Vice President of the European Commission, Maros Šefčovič, who happens to be from Slovakia, and who is the main enemy of Nord Stream 2 in the European Commission. The other person is the Energy Commissioner, the Spaniard Canate, who says the same things, but perhaps not with the same energy and not pushing it in the same fashion. One would expect the Competition Commissioner Margrethe Vestager from Denmark, who is otherwise quite a tough lady, in particular when it comes to a US high-tech company, but somewhat soft-spoken when it comes to these topics. It appears to me that she has more or less stayed out of a Nord Stream 2 debate. And of course, a very important person here is the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, who tends to stick to a rather light work burden and delegate much of his work to his chef de cabinet, who's a very skillful German coming from CDU, but with a clear inclination to approve of Nord Stream 2. So these are essentially the people we are seeing. So what we want to see is that Maros Šefčovič acts as hard and firmly as possible. And the good thing is that he is. On the 8th of November, he made a very clear statement that the energy union principles should apply with regard to transparency, accessibility, and efficiency, also to pipelines leading to Europe. So in a roundabout fashion, he says that Nord Stream 2 is not acceptable. And as if to confirm that we had understood this rightly, Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev yesterday complained about Šefčovič's statement, not only about that, but about the new EU policy. So something here is cooking, that
Right.
the EU policy is changing. And here I'm coming to the third point, which is the national level. I've already mentioned the East European countries that are taking a firm stand. And the only country that is strongly in favor has been Germany. But this has been very much focused on Minister for Foreign Affairs from SPD, the Social Democrat Sigmar Gabriel, and he's out. So it's very likely that the new coalition with FDP and the Greens not being in favor of Nord Stream 2 for sound foreign policy and competition reasons, that they will go against it. It appears to me that Chancellor Merkel has done a simple compromise. She has said that Nord Stream 2 is a commercial project, and having said that, the Social Democrats have approved of the sanctions, and then she has been in a fine place. Now I don't think that she needs to say that this is a commercial project any longer, so that she can stand up together with the Greens and the Free Democrats. And therefore I think that there is good hope that the European politics is changing to the benefit. I should add here Denmark's position on Nord Stream 2 would go through Danish territorial waters, but the Danes have late in the day woken up and said that we don't want that, and therefore they are now demanding that Nord Stream 2 goes outside of Danish waters, which is perfectly possible, but it takes some time. It means that they have to recalculate a bit, and it delays the process. Finally, I should take the companies that are involved. Gazprom essentially will pay for the whole thing in one way or the other. And 5 European companies are all in favor. 2 German energy companies, OMV of Austria. Austria is fully with Germany on this matter. And so is Royal Dutch Shell and Holland. Engie of France is also involved, but France does not seem to be as committed to Nord Stream 2 as the other 3 countries. So my guess is that we have in the last few weeks seen the balance turning against Nord Stream 2. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question about the financing that you said Gazprom is going to pay for the project mostly. Gazprom Bank is under sanctions from the first round of sanctions for the annexation of Ukraine. Russia has experienced serious economic, financial problems as a result of the low oil prices for a while. How is Russia going to pay, and what kind of sacrifice they're going ready to make to realize such a political project?
Russia can always finance what they really want to finance because the reserves are more than $420 billion. Russia's public debt is only 13% of GDP. So if Russia really wants to move $10 billion, it's just to move the money from the central bank to the Ministry of Finance in exchange for bonds. So this is technically how the financing can be done. But having said that, clearly Putin wants to have $400 billion in international reserves. This is what he sees is the cushion that Russia needs. So it's a considerable sacrifice. And
10 billion.
it is a serious constraint, but it's not insurmountable.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, to clarify, this Gazprom Bank is not under full treasury blocking sanctions. It is under financial restrictions, which means it has restrictions on medium and long-term debt and equity investments. Therefore, Anders is right that the Russians basically cannot raise money on commercial markets for Nord Stream 2, even if all other things were equal. They couldn't do it, and therefore they have to basically pay cash. So it is a much more expensive project. Whether or not it's viable, given the possible changes in the EU, I can't say. But the effect of sanctions is to mean they have to pull the money out of the reserves rather than raise it on commercial markets.
Thank you. Michael, what would you add about Kremlin's objectives with this project in terms of their position financially right now? And there are many interests. One of them is Turkish Stream, of course, another venture that they're trying to finance at the moment.
Well, look, President Putin was willing to spend $50 billion on the vanity project of the Sochi Olympics, so I think he's willing to spend a similar amount of money on a political project that will have long-term strategic consequences for Russia as well as for the EU. But let me back up a little bit and talk about, because when we talk about sanctions, when we talk about this project, it's important to remember sort of how Russia has approached this in the past. So Europe has been, and particularly Europe's consumption of gas has been the cash cow for Russia for decades and decades. It's a model that's relied on piped gas from Russia to Europe, and in the past has fundamentally relied on a couple of different tools to essentially bilateralize Russia's energy relations with individual European countries. They've done this through long-term contracts, through what's called destination clauses, and through take-or-pay clauses. Now, some of that has gone away, but by ensuring that Russian gas flowing to a particular European country cannot be rerouted to another country, as was the case in the past with destination clauses, Russia has been able to bilateralize its relations with each of those countries. Now, why is this important? It's important in an economic sense because it gives Russia monopolistic power, but it's also important precisely because Russia uses energy as a political weapon. And so, if you look at the price of gas that various European countries paid, particularly in the past, a decade ago, they were wildly different. Why? Because Russia was able to charge certain countries higher prices, and with others, if they align their foreign policies more closely with Russia's, they could secure discounts on gas. And so that is how Russia played the game. Now, if you look at Nord Stream 2, some of these tools have gone away. Destination clauses have largely gone away. Take or pay has gone away. But Nord Stream 2, by channeling an additional large quantity of supply to Germany specifically, is a functional equivalent of these tools of the past. It aims to bilateralize Germany's energy relationship with Europe via Germany. And so that is a concern because precisely of the issues that Dan has raised, which is that Germany is central to maintaining consensus on sanctions against Russia for Ukraine, and because Germany is the powerhouse of Europe. And so that is why this project is so dangerous from my perspective, and also because, let's be honest, as Matt said, Russia doesn't play the game on the same playing field as we do, or at least it's not a level playing field. So Russia, for example, is able to finance anti-fracking NGOs in places like Bulgaria or Romania in order to advance its interests in piped gas to Europe and preclude the sale of shale or LNG derived gas. And then also it is able to use its propaganda measures, which have been so much in the news these days, social media and others, to, for example, cause environmental or amplify environmental opposition to the Trans-Adriatic pipeline, which would bring Azerbaijani gas to Italy and onwards to Western Europe. So, and we've seen this in terms of some of the movements. I'm not saying these movements are completely manufactured out of thin air by Russia, but Russia amplifies these. So they play dirty games that we don't play. And that makes for a very uneven playing field and requires the use of additional levers by the West to include, I think, the threat that Section 232 poses. I don't think it should be used as a cudgel, but I think it should be held in reserve to force the Commission, and Šefčovič in particular, to take robust action on unbundling and accessibility and so on and so forth. The last thing I just wanted to comment on Dan's comment, fully agree that the announcement on sanctions, the list that was made, a different topic, but on defense and intelligence entities was a solid list. The guidance that OFAC issued, I agree, solid guidance. But I wouldn't want this group to take away from this that we are on the right track in terms of implementing sanctions on Russia, because a lot will depend, as Dan knows far better than I, on the definition of very key terms in the legislation, such as significant transactions. What is a significant transaction? The bar can be either very high or very low, and the administration has not said how it's going to do that. So keep watching this space, and as I tell staffers on the Hill, watch the administration like a hawk.
The prices, in terms of prices, from the history of Russian sales of gas to Europe, we can see that the cheapest prices actually have been in Western Europe. The highest prices have been in Eastern Europe. In fact, Bulgaria and Macedonia have paid the highest prices for Russian gas for years. So by isolating Eastern Europe from direct sales, that means from bilateral relations with Russia, isn't Russia going to lose on the price market? And the other question is, when Russia starts dumping the prices of gas, because the Western European clients are used to lower prices, and because LNG is coming to Europe, what is going to be the European Union's reaction to that? And what is going to be effect on our American LNG exports? Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Russia is really hopeless on the gas market in every relevant regard. Russia has today an overcapacity of about 150 billion cubic meters a year that it can't utilize. Gazprom has massively overinvested, not only in pipelines, but also in production facilities. I think that Gazprom, in this process with the European Commission about the competition rules, has essentially given up, not take or pay, as Mike mentioned, and the destination clause, and it's going over to spot market prices, lower prices. The price setter today in Europe is LNG. And we see, my favorite example here is Lithuania. Lithuania has got LNG terminal, the floating LNG terminal, and thanks to this, it now imports 2/3 of its gas as LNG, because Gazprom is so clumsy that with much lower production costs, it can't conclude agreements with Lithuania, so that Lithuania buys it. And this is not a political approach from Lithuania. They try to, as far as I understand, doing in an open competition. And Gazprom is simply too clumsy. We can also see that Gazprom is giving up its ownership of the gas pipelines in all 3 Baltic countries. I'm not quite sure how far it has proceeded in these countries, because it is simply not sufficiently nimble to approach such relatively small customers. It wants to focus on the big customers and doesn't really care about the others. So Russia is losing out, and it doesn't really seem to care very much about it.
Thank you, Ambassador Bryce.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd just like to amplify some of that. I mean, yeah, the Baltic market, I was talking about creating a liberal liquid market, but it is, yeah, it's minor for Gazprom. Gazprom, for years, has been desperate to sell gas in Europe because you get a lot more money selling the gas in Europe than domestically in Russia, right? I mean, that's been something that Gazprom's been saddled with for a long time. And we've seen in the last few years that other Russian gas producers have come to the fore, Rosneft, Novatek. You can debate whether or not those are really independent companies, independent of Gazprom or President Putin. But what we do see, generally, going back to the beginning, is that there is a push from the east, from the north, Nord Stream, from the south, Turk Stream, from Egypt, right, from the Eastern Med by Rosneft, from northern Iraq, also by Rosneft. There is a big push all around Europe's northern, eastern, southern periphery by Russian energy entities to get back in the game. I completely agree with Dan that the depth of the problem is lessened because of what the EU put in place in terms of policy. And we should, by the way, take some credit because we had to push pretty damn hard. And anyway, the EU did the right thing. But Russia is trying to get back in the game with the same geopolitical objectives in mind. So my last comment, just let's sit back for a second and think about the context here. We're in a situation in which, with sanctions, we're trying to keep Russia kind of in quote-unquote, the box. Not contain it, but impose costs for invading Ukraine and annexing Crimea. And energy is the main tool Russia is trying to use to get out of the box. So how in the world could it be okay for the most powerful economic actor in Europe to turn the other way and say, oh, okay, Nord Stream 2, that's going to be fine. The sanctions, sure, we're going to continue with those sanctions, but Nord Stream 2 is okay. And then you amplify that with what Anders said a little while ago, the transit fees. So the rents are going away from a country, Ukraine, that really needs them for survival, to Germany, which will benefit some companies, of course, but strategically, there's a disbalance here. I'm in the private sector now. I don't like so much when governments intervene with what I'm doing. I'm in Turkey, environmental, the oil spill response company. But sometimes that's the job of the government, is to intervene and tell its companies, this is not acceptable. This Exxon is losing out in the Black Sea because of sanctions. It's losing out in the Arctic. Our government took a painful decision. Maybe it's time, and it's going to happen, that the German government will also take a painful decision. Some of its companies won't be so happy, but strategically, without the SPD and the coalition, the government will do something different. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. This was really a fascinating discussion. Let's open to questions now and continue it from the audience. Please, introduce yourself, please.
Yes, of course. My name is John Garrett, the recipient of the Charles Koch Foundation Research Grant and Grant Strategy. I'm doing my research on Russian grant strategy, United States responses. I actually have two brief questions. I suspect that the answers won't be very brief, but if it suits you, just simple yeses or no's would do fine. Oh, sorry. Here. I've got them written down here somewhere. Just give me a moment. Okay, first question for Ambassador Bryza, Dr. Carpenter. I'm curious as to what you think, setting aside environmental concerns, will the increase in fracking in the United States, say if we were to increase fracking in the United States, increase liquid natural gas in the United States exports, would that counter Russia? Would it be a useful measure that we could take? Why or why not? And then another question for Ambassador Fried. You talked about the future frontier sanctions, particularly in the Arctic Sea. I'm curious because I'm aware of the fact that the Russian Federation has massive reserves, something like on the order of estimates of trillions in petroleum. So how far in the future are we talking here?
Questions? Ambassador Bryce?
Yes. Amos will say more later, of course. But of course, I mean, the U.S. Unconventionally produced or producible oil and gas have revolutionized the oil and gas industry, right? I mean, the United States is, again, the world's largest producer of oil and gas. And the IEA just in the last couple of days put out a report, say Fatih Birol was saying that the U.S. is going to be the world's predominant energy supplier into the foreseeable future. Strategically, that means a lot. But that wasn't a strategic decision. It was just the market working, right? It was American technology, ingenuity, and the market that already established that enabled the new technologies to be applied in a way that created this abundance of new resources. And by the way, that's also why I think that destination clauses are going away, and take-or-pay agreements as well, because Gazprom can't insist on those because there's this abundance now of natural gas in what is truly a buyer's market. This will be a buyer's market for the next at least 5 years or so. Who knows how long it'll last, but it's definitely a buyer's market. Amos, he'll talk about Tellurian, but now the companies like Cheniere, other U.S. LNG producers, they have already paid, they've covered their investments for their initial trains of liquefaction. And so now they've got gas that's producible for marginal costs. They don't have to pay for the investment anymore. So for the next few years, you'll have really cheap spot market gas. The challenge, I think, for our Eastern European friends, including Lithuania especially, is not to think so short term. If you're in government now or in the state-run energy or state-owned energy entity, you want to keep your job, you want to have, show good marks, good performance. So the focus is on getting short-term spot cargoes of U.S. or any LNG. There's a lot of Australian LNG obviously coming on stream. There'll be more from all over the place, from Mozambique eventually. But I believe there is a way, in a voluntary way, that large consumers in, let's say, Northeast Europe could voluntarily cooperate, not collude, but cooperate to develop enough market muscle that it would attract the U.S. LNG producers who in the next phase, when they have to invest in the next round of liquefaction, would say, let's look at longer-term contracts for the next round, and then maybe the U.S. producers, as they seek that future investment, will give a price break to the Eastern Europeans now for looking forward into the future. So it's a long-winded way of saying yes. The LNG produced in the U.S. and in fracked or unconventionally produced gas is a huge game changer, and the same for oil.
My colleagues may know the numbers better than I do, but basically, the simple size of potential Russian reserves is not the important thing. The important thing is what is the cost of those marginal reserves. And what we discovered when we looked at it in 2014, 2015, is that it is going to become increasingly more expensive for Russia to tap its reserves, and it will need that frontier oil technology. That's why the Russians were so interested in these Arctic deals, including the one with ExxonMobil, which the sanctions shut down. The drop in the price of oil from $100+ a barrel, where it was when we instituted the sanctions, to where it is now, meant that the whole question became moot, because at that price, the frontier oil technology didn't make any sense anyway. So it turns out that of our set of sanctions, the energy technology sanctions were less effective, but the financial sanctions were relatively more effective. So it was a wash. But anyway, that's the answer about the numbers. We looked at it. The other factor to keep in mind is that what's the good of sanctioning traditional oil technology? The Russians already have that. So what are you accomplishing? But they do not have the frontier technology. That is largely in European, American, and a little bit Japanese hands. And the Chinese don't have that stuff yet. So we consider this to be an effective sanction.
Thank you. Questions? Yes, please. Glenn.
Dan, you have many disciples and around this town, and there's one now that's, I would say, sitting in State Department who's just been appointed. And I know this is a very contentious issue, but over the future of U.S.-German relations. But how would you answer Matt's arguments about the whole nature of sanctions and what Russia did in Crimea and annexing Crimea and now occupying Donbass? I mean, the purpose of the sanctions is to punish Russia, but it seems with the Nord Stream 2 that we are actually, by ignoring it and trying to lean on the Germans, and especially now it has some coalition partners who don't like Nord Stream 2, why can't we just try to raise this issue bilaterally and try to and see where we can go with this and flexing our own muscles a little bit on this issue?
Purpose of sanctions is to change behavior, to change Russia's calculation of the correlation of forces and get them to do a serious deal on Ukraine. We'll see if it succeeds, right? What I was saying is not that we should avoid raising Nord Stream 2 with the Germans. What I was saying is that the use of sanctions would not, in this case, would not advance that objective, because that would eat at the heart, that would rebound in German politics in a way that would not help us. So what Anders was suggesting is, to me, more productive. Let the Germans work this out and then start talking to them. Now, the other problem is that a lot of my colleagues in the administration who want to do what I consider to be the right thing are working in a complicated environment. So if you're going to go to the Germans, let's say you're Wes Mitchell, the new Assistant Secretary of State for Europe. You're going to the Germans and you want to raise quietly Nord Stream 2 along the lines you've discussed. The Germans might be forgiven for asking, and whom does he represent exactly? Because of questions about, the nature of U.S. policy. This is a natural question. I would prefer, therefore, as a matter of pure tactics, to let the EU, work with the EU, as we have been doing. The Directorate General for Energy is filled with solid people on this question. Work with Germany quietly, and then if Wes is confident that he can represent to the Germans something nobody up his chain is going to counter, then do it. Okay, so that's, I'm giving you a tactical answer based on what I consider to be the best way forward given German politics and our own. I'm not arguing with your strategic assessment.
So you're saying to work along two fronts, West do his due diligence in Eastern Europe and other areas, then talk to the Germans.
Yep, and work with the EU. And work with the EU. Yeah, you gotta, working with the EU is like working with the US government. You gotta touch different points, all the different players. You can't be impatient, but it's worth it, because you can get good results when you do it right.
Next question.
Mambuka Tsereteli with the Central Asia Caucasus Institute. Two comments, one includes question. Anders mentioned that Russia will no longer can no longer use Ukraine pipeline, but isn't it Russia's actually intention to change this balance of interdependency that it has with the transit and consumer countries in Eastern Europe? And that's one of the objectives that Russia has, to actually make these countries dependent without Russia being dependent on them for transit to Western Europe. But my question is to the entire panel: if you are German, sitting in Berlin or other places, don't you want all the pipelines to come through Germany and go to other places through Germany? Isn't it sort of strategic, maybe objective of Germany to have all those pipelines coming to Europe via Germany? Thanks.
Who is going to answer? Okay.
Well, I can take it. Of course, it's always nice to have transit income. Everybody wants to have transit pipelines, so that makes perfect sense in general. On the pipelines, we can look up on the oil pipelines, which are sort of politically neutral. And Russia has concentrated everything to the Baltic pipeline system that goes to the area around St. Petersburg when it comes to oil. And Druzhba, the oil pipeline that goes through Ukraine, is quietly being reduced, and we never talk about it. Nobody discusses it. This is simply basic Russian policy. So the idea is take everything that you possibly can through Russia as far as possible. So also the gas pipelines, that they should go to the area around St. Petersburg and then on directly to the target. But it's As I mentioned on the Baltic countries, it's amazing how little interested Gazprom is actually in selling gas. It's much more interested, it seems, in two other things: that certain people make money on building pipelines, which is very important in the Russian context, and the second, geopolitics. Commercial considerations are a low third in Gazprom's world.
Michael
If I
Carpenter.
could just pick up. So, of course, it's in Germany's national interest to have pipelines come through Germany. But there's an element of this policy that is beggar thy neighbor, because this disadvantages, of course, not just Ukraine, but as has been mentioned, so many other countries, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Poland, and others. And so in an era where you're developing a union and striving towards an energy union, one has to adopt policies that are in keeping with that objective. And to get to the question that was raised earlier, and of course Matt explained it beautifully, I have nothing to add to that, but if you're going to have unconventional gas especially be revolutionary in Europe, you have to make the market for it as liquid as possible, which means you have to invest in the infrastructure. So it's not just about the gas being ready and available from the United States to be put onto tankers, but you have to have the terminals to be able to absorb that supply in Europe. And so Klaipeda was mentioned, Świnoujście in Poland has received U.S. cargoes, but there are many other projects, including Kirk Island in Croatia, as well as a variety of north-south interconnectors that are crucial to enabling this additional supply from a different source of gas to flow within the market to make it more competitive and to reduce this policy of monopolistic bilateralization or seeking rents that Russia has applied so successfully.
I think it all boils down to a government decision and choice in Germany, whether it's more important to them to have the pipelines going directly to Germany and have all the benefits from being a transit country, or to secure a peace in the neighborhood. Because if Germany is willing to cooperate with Russia on Nord Stream, I don't see how effective Germany can be in implementing other sanctions and pushing for an agreement on Ukraine. Once you give in to Russia, you're perceived as a weak side. So that exploitation continues, and of course, the bully wins. I think it's a comprehensive policy that Berlin needs to make a decision on. What is more important, peace and security or profits? Vlad Sokor.
Vladimir Sokor, Jamestown Foundation. A few weeks ago, Rainer Seele, the longtime head of Wintershall, currently head of OMV, and one of the staunchest allies of Gazprom and the Kremlin in the European energy business, issued an anguished cry regarding the US sanctions. He said the uncertainty over these sanctions is such that we, the partners of Gazprom in Nord Stream, can no longer take the risk of financing this project. We have to await clarification about the implementation of the US sanction before we can make an investment decision. And pending that, we are limited to just bridge financing. A few weeks later, after those guidelines were made public, I think Mr. Seele has reason to feel reassured. And not only he, but of course, the other members of the Gazprom-led project. Lesson: even if you don't slam the sanctions on them, at least maintain the uncertainty. Even if you don't drop that sword of Damocles on their necks, at least put that sword of Damocles in the air. You can play it that way. What do you think, Dan?
Vlad, I do hate it when you come at me from the right on Russia sanctions, but that happens so seldom that, I can handle it once in a while. In principle, you're right. That is the deterrent effect of sanctions and the cloud it casts over economic activity is not a bug of the sanctions. It's a feature, and it is a feature often to be cherished, because sanctions are not pleasant, nor are they designed to be so. However, in the case of pipelines, because of the German politics that I've described, I didn't think that Section 232 was the wisest application of this principle, with which I generally agree. And the coming as it did during the German elections, it was a political gift to the SPD and strengthened their arguments and an embarrassment to the Chancellery. So under those circumstances, I'll still maintain the position, but I won't argue with you about the general proposition. I do think there are still ways to get at Nord Stream 2, and we've been discussing them, and I would favor them. And the Germans know this. I mean, they are under no illusions that just because 232 is not the proper instruments, that the United States, or at least that those of us who are occasionally in contact with parts of the administration, have backed off our general view. I don't expect that'll satisfy you, but I wanted to give you a real answer to the thinking.
Okay, Andres has something to add.
Yeah, I would actually argue against uncertainty on the sanctions in general. I don't think that one should maintain that, because the consequence as it is today, no Russian businessman dares to invest anything in the United States, hardly anything in the EU. There should be some clear lines what will not be obviously touched by sanctions in an early stage. Basically, I think that one should concentrate on certain sectors and the state companies in them. I mean, I don't mind going after Gazprom, but I think that one should keep the private sector, in particular smaller companies, aside so that they are not afraid of being subject to sanctions.
Thank you. There is a question here.
Yeah,
First, and then there.
Hi, Ilya Zaslavsky. I used to work on Gazprom in BP's subsidiary in Russia, and I'm now writing for think tanks in DC. If I may, very few quick comments and then a question. We just released a report at Free Russia Foundation called Corruption Pipeline, Nord Stream 2 Threat to EU Security and Democracy. This brings me to what hasn't been mentioned or hasn't been mentioned enough. So there is this supposed uncertainty about whether Nord Stream 2 is commercial or not. And somehow many Western partners, especially Western partners of Gazprom, but also decision makers, don't want to look at corruption issues of Gazprom, which are actually out in the open. And I wished we could, I urge US policymakers to be more explicit about it, because just recently, Usmanov and Gazprom Invest Holding, we know what they did through Paradise Papers. But two very quick cases. The main beneficiary of Nord Stream 1 were Rottenberg brothers, who we know from many investigations received more than $1 billion through very murky contracts. And also, when in Germany they say, well, I heard that during discussion of Nord Stream 2 in July in Berlin at DJP, that, well, that corruption is just in Russia. Well, no, it's not. In the own electoral district of Angela Merkel in Pomerania, there is a case which hasn't been covered enough in English-speaking press, but was covered in Russia and was covered in Germany, that there were Nordic yards bought by Yusupov, former Minister of Energy under Putin and Gazprom board member, and his son participated in it, who was head of Nord Stream 1 office in Moscow. They bought these Nordic yachts, which were supposed to participate actually in supplying of vessels to for Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. Well, this is a major criminal story. They're mentioned in Spanish prosecution papers. Germans are reluctantly investigating them, and the whole thing sort of closed down, but it involves money laundering, Russian organized crime. Just to return to the point, no, it's not. It's definitely not a commercially viable project. It's done at the expense of Russian taxpayers. It's not supported by all Russians. My friend Vladimir Milov former Deputy Minister of Energy, who is quoted here, is against it, as many other people. Boris Nemtsov, former Deputy Minister in charge of energy, was against South Stream and Nord Stream 2, saying that it robs Russian budget. So it's Kremlin's game of subsidizing it at the expense of Russian budget. I also, what hasn't been mentioned here is public relations people here in DC and in Europe who, like Richard Byrd, former US ambassador to Germany, and McClarty Associates, supporting Gazprom here in this capital, or a natural gas program of Oxford Institute of Energy Studies, who is officially sponsored by, half of it is sponsored by Gazprom and its partners. So I wish we mentioned these things. And finally, energy propaganda of Gazprom. That should be, there is a major continued trend of disinformation coming from Gazprom and its partners about demand for gas in Europe, about actual requirements of, for Russian gas in Europe, about shale gas, especially in Romania and Bulgaria, and so forth. We should introduce special disinformation units on energy. And so now, finally, to the question. Because all of it relates to the question. So currently, the specific sanctions mentioned on Nord Stream 2 are at the discretion of the administration. So my question is, if for some reason Trump administration decides not to implement them, do you think Congress will push and make it somehow compulsory and not at the discretion of the administration? That's question number one. And secondly, do you think it's about the time that we should not only look at and block these actions of Gazprom, but actually of Gazprom Western partners, especially these 5 companies? Because we have a precedent. At EITI, Western companies were pressured by civil society, by some policymakers, to expel Azerbaijan from EITI. With Iran sanctions, Western companies were blocked specifically to participate in Iranian upstream. Why is it not the case that now that we know that Nord Stream 1 was a corruption case, and now these Western companies want knowingly to participate in a new corruption project? Shouldn't it be some action against the partners of Gazprom, not just Gazprom itself? Thank you.
Very important questions about corruption and funding by Gazprom of different companies, different organizations to do their PR work in the West and also in Eastern Europe as well. Dan, you want to?
You've raised a number of big questions that are both big and serious. The issues of Russian money, Russian-funded corruption, and disinformation are all things beyond the scope of Nord Stream pipeline, but Nord Stream pipeline touched on it, as you've said. That is a big question. We are just beginning to understand the magnitude of the problem, and we Americans are behind the Europeans, some of whom have been dealing with this up close and personal for longer than we have. So I agree with you. But before I get on a soapbox and start lecturing about Gerhard Schroeder's questionable actions when he was chancellor, what am I to say with respect to the current Secretary of Commerce of the United States, who has an arm's length but demonstrable business relationship with Gennady Timchenko, who's on the SDN list, the full blocking sanctions list? The secretary has not denied this relationship. He's basically said it's no big deal. Well, when I was sanctions coordinator for the United States, for the State Department, working for the US government, how do you imagine the conversation would have gone had I an arm's length business relationship with Gennady Timchenko, with the security officials at the Department of State and the ethics lawyers? How do you imagine that would have played out? Right. So I find, let us just say that this is a general problem. And as an American, I am in no position to get all sanctimonious about Europeans. That's a big deal. With respect to sanctions, one of the provisions in CATSA, the big sanctions law, referred to corrupt individuals. Now that's hard to prove, but hard is not impossible. I said earlier that there were parts of the sanctions law I thought the administration ought to be properly cautious about. There are others where it ought to be forward-leaning. It ought to be forward-leaning with respect to the sanctions provision on cyber, on corruption, on human rights violations, and the so-called, with respect to the so-called Kremlin report, which is only a report, not a sanction, but read the paper that Anders Asland and I, Andrei Piontkovsky and Andrei Illarionov put out day before yesterday. That's where the administration ought to be forward-looking. Nord Stream 2 has its own complications, and that is not, in my view, the best vehicle to address the larger relevant issues that you've raised. But, oh, yes, we have to get at disinformation. We have to get to the sources of money that support disinformation. And the Kremlin report can do that, plus the pieces of sanctions. And for God's sakes, let's start taking a look more generally at the inflows of dark Russian money into the United States, into London, into European cities, and clean up our act.
If I could just thank you for raising corruption, such an important issue. We often forget about the enormous corruption cases that we all know about. Rosukreenergo was an artificial middleman organization created between Gazprom and Naftogaz, which sucked billions of dollars away, actually, from Gazprom's bottom line into Kremlin-connected oligarchs, and that money, that cash, eventually found its way back to the Kremlin. This is exactly how the Kremlin uses energy as both a political tool, but also to further its financial interests. With reference to Germany, let's not forget the Deutsche Bank case. Deutsche Bank was fined by the state of New York $475 million for $10 billion in money laundering for its Russian clients. I mean, that is an astounding figure. And other investigatory bodies have found over 20 billion in separate money laundering schemes through the so-called Moldovan and Latvian laundromats. This is important stuff. And so thank you for raising it. I agree with, I wanted to pick up on what Dan said. I agree that sanctioning Gazprom's partners in Europe may not be the best approach. But I would favor, step back a little bit. We have currently sanctions in place in the defense sector, in the energy sector, and in the financial sector. Energy and defense are forward-leaning. They look into the future. They deny Russia the ability to generate revenues over the long term. But the financial sanctions are more short-term in nature. Right now, they are, I would say, minimalistic. There is so much more scope. Dan would disagree with me. I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, they are at a 2 or a 3 at most. When compared to the sort of full blocking sanctions that have been put in place, say, in Iran or in other places, or on certain Russian entities, we could achieve so much more of our geopolitical objectives simply by cranking up the short-term financial sanctions, by instituting full blocking sanctions on important Russian financial institutions like Gazprom Bank. And we should do so. We should incentivize progress on other issues by looking at that. I wouldn't go after European energy companies. That just simply creates dissensus within the transatlantic community.
Just really quick, yeah, the Rosukreenergo deal. I mean, who was the head of Rosukreenergo in Budapest? It was Semyon Mogilevich, who was, he was on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list just a couple of years after 9/11. There are a lot of other bad people we were going after, but yeah, he ran Rosukreenergo. And then you mentioned Vladimir Milov. Yeah. So he said at one of our conferences in Thailand a couple of years ago, he said his friends in Gazprom would joke, but tragically they'd say, as Anders was saying, the pipelines are a way to make money, obviously, right? And he said, a lot of people in Gazprom said, there's so many kickbacks, But developing these projects are so difficult, it's such a pain. Why don't we just give the kickbacks to the officials, forget the projects, and move on, and we'd be a much more efficient company.
Last question. Over there.
Hi, Benjamin Schmidt, State Department's Bureau of Energy Resources. I just wanted to maybe give a little bit of of context of just where we're at, and then have a question on multidisciplinary threats and how institutions can address them. The administration continues to have concerns that appeared in the previous administration, and we share those concerns with our European allies about projects like Nord Stream 2 for a variety of reasons. This includes, of course, the negative economic and strategic impact on Ukraine, the loss, I guess, in 2016 dollars of 2.2 billion. It sounds from Anders like that would increase the undermining of European energy security and diversification efforts that we've worked tirelessly on, not recently, not to sell U.S. LNG, but for 30 or more years. And starting with the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipeline all the way through all of the diversification efforts of the European Energy Union. And then finally, looking at kind of the more geostrategic elements, especially Baltic Sea security, which I'll get back to in just a second. I do want to it's made our jobs a lot harder as diplomats most recently in the past few years since we started looking at this project in particular because of disinformation and malign influence. Nord Stream, continues to kind of be this test case as a vehicle for disinformation, not just from, your usual suspects like RT and Sputnik, but more, exotic websites like MiceTimes.Asia and others like this that just seem to have this very key interest in European energy and Russian energy pipelines. We also saw this Politico article that Nord Stream was the second largest contract in terms of lobbying in the last quarter that came out from Politico in Washington. It's all around Europe, of course, but we saw that come out a few weeks ago as well. But to the Baltic Sea security, and this is where I want to ask about multidisciplinary looking at these sort of issues. Because of the increasingly aggressive military posture that the Russian Federation has taken over the past 2 years, in the Baltic Sea region in particular, we've seen Denmark take steps, as you've mentioned, to look at potentially blocking the territorial sea transit of the pipeline for national security concerns. We saw at the end of 2016, Sweden block the ports of Nordshipping on the mainland and Slite on the strategic island of Gotland from being used as logistical deployment ports for the pipeline, citing hybrid threats and kind of this. Looking at this in the similar way that Crimea had the little green men sort of situation, and having those sort of concerns. We did see earlier this year that Nord Stream approached the port of Ventspils in Latvia for the same use as a central Baltic deployment port, and then noted that under the same concerns in May of this year, Latvia said no, that they also would not host such a port. But just a few weeks later, Reuters reported that 90% of Russian railways traffic to the ports of Ventspils and Riga were cut off, allegedly in retaliation for this sort of concern. So in this sort of geostrategic and military security, energy security, hybrid security, disinformation bin, how do our institutions become more resilient and better address these at these kind of the edges of the Venn diagrams of a number of these areas?
Well, hearing you speak and hearing you ask that question in the way you did is one of the better pieces of news today. I think that's just great. It means that the culture of the Bureau of Energy Affairs that Amos Hochstein led has persisted, and good for continuity in this case. Bravo. The administration, I argued earlier that the administration has done a decent job administering the sanctions so far. The administration also needs to take a serious look at Russia policy, and to the degree it is possible to do so in the current political climate, to put its back into the issues you've just raised. Happily, the administration has not backed away from the previous administration's commitment to forward deployments by NATO into the Baltics and Poland. Rotational deployments, but we're there. That's a big step forward. That's only one piece. And even in the military dimension, that's not enough. There are issues that need to be addressed. Everything you raised is a legitimate issue. It is my understanding, I haven't seen it, that there is a Russia policy that the interagency has put together. It is also my understanding that that policy is based on several pillars, one of which is resisting Russian aggression and helping countries, the more vulnerable objects of Russian aggression, to become resilient as they face it. That needs to be, I would like to see that policy rolled out. A little difficult now, but I think it's never going to get easy. It's not going to get easier for a while. Roll it out, implement it, and mean it. I think Wes Mitchell, the Assistant Secretary for Europe, is somebody credible who could help with that. I think that Fiona Hill at NSC, equally credible. The emerging team at OSD, where Mike Carpenter worked, looks pretty strong. They ought to do this. You all ought to do this, in my view. And by all means, another pillar of their policy could be cooperate with the Russians where possible. Go ahead. I mean, if you're an optimist, we may find something. If you're a pessimist, yeah, knock yourselves out. But in no case would I oppose seeking areas of cooperation with Russia where we can find them if we don't pay the Russians in advance for the privilege of cooperating on areas supposedly in mutual interest. Don't pay them. Don't give away other countries. You know the story. Cooperate straightforward and push back against aggression in a straightforward fashion. It's my answer. You raised all the right questions, but you're in the administration. Go get them.
I will ask each panelist to make concluding comments.
Just real quick on that. So, I mean, that's a great question. And as you probably know, after the Swedish government said no to using the staging areas in Nordköping and in Gotland, Gazprom found another port that it was able to use, because in Sweden, local authorities make these decisions and not the national government. And so there, one has to look simply at the incentive structure, and the Swedish government there has to apply national policies and national politics to this particular situation. In the case of Latvia, though, I am a big proponent of us using asymmetric tools of our own. There are a number of projects that are being considered for military-to-military cooperation with Latvia, such as establishing a regional rotary wing training center in Latvia, which is right now used as a staging base for some of our helicopters in the region. Let's boost that up. Let's give them something in return. It doesn't have to be in the same lane as railroad traffic. There's obviously the United States is not going to be able to compete on that score, but maybe there's something else we can do to help them out in some other area. I'm all in favor of looking sort of at this creatively and holistically, and not just sort of bend into different lanes of, well, we can't really respond to that because we don't have that tool, so let's just let it go. Because then the incentive structure is all wrong.
Thank you very much, Ben, for raising this point about the problems that the three Baltic countries have, in particular Latvia, of choosing should they cooperate with one another or should they cooperate with Russia. Normally you have massive money being available immediately for cooperation with Russia, while the Baltic cooperation projects are long-term, require big investments in Via Baltica, Rail Baltica, and pipelines and electrical grid. And what you're really saying is the United States and the European Union should both be heavily engaged in getting this right, so that the local governments get the incentives right, because this is a strife all the time. Because these three countries are then also competing. For example, LNG terminals has been a typical matter. Who should have an LNG terminal? Well, of course, all three of them in the end seem to be getting the LNG terminals, while they could have one together and have pipelines connecting them. There has been problem with Gazprom owning the part of the pipelines, or about half of pipelines, and in fact controlling them. That is now going away. So what your question suggests is that there should be a much more forward-leaning policy on infrastructure for the three Baltic countries for their security interests. Thank you.
Ambassador Breiser?
There's really not much to add. I mean, what comprehensive discussion. I just am taken with the directive to follow the money. I overheard a conversation a couple of years ago in some country with, they're citizens of that country here, and this guy said, you know, it's really difficult to launder $1 billion. It's really hard. and that's where these pipeline projects often come in, and these infrastructure projects, and that would be an asymmetric response. Really go after those flows of money and show how they go back to you-know-whom. And if nothing else, if we can't prosecute them in our courts or cut off their financial flows, expose it. Thanks.
Thank you. So the conclusion is some policies should be continued regardless of the change of administrations because they're good for European energy security, for our own interests in European energy in general, in our exports. Thank you very much, Ambassador Breiser, Dr. Carpenter, Dr. Asland, Ambassador Fried. Thank you for excellent panel.